Trauma. A 6-letter word, small in stature but grand in meaning. Traumatic events imprint our lives. There will always be a before and an after, and in the after, everything will have changed. In many ways, the impact of trauma is textbook, meaning individuals all seem to gravitate toward the same behaviors. For example, the Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE survey, is a predictor of future behavior and even health conditions. These adverse childhood experiences focus on 3 areas where trauma can occur, such as abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. The thing is, the higher the score of this test, the higher the likelihood of health issues or mental health challenges. People with high ACE scores are 2 times more likely to smoke, 12 times more likely to attempt suicide in their lifetime, as well as being likely to suffer from health issues like severe obesity, diabetes, stroke, and more. I scored an 8 out of 10, and if you listen regularly, you know I've definitely struggled through addiction. I've also smoked heavily most of my life, but I smoked my last cigarette on January 1st of this year. I'm also a late diagnosed diabetic. Researching the ACE survey and reading the adverse effects blew my mind because, at least in my case, it was startlingly accurate. How we respond to trauma has a direct result on how we live our lives. Trauma responses are people's way of ensuring physical and emotional safety. And trauma is far-reaching. Often, traumatic events have a ripple effect. Think about it like this. When you throw a stone into the lake, it doesn't just sink down. No, it causes the water to ripple, which impacts every shore of that body of water. Much like this, when something traumatic occurs, it isn't just limited to one individual. Just as the rock causes the water to ripple, the event can cascade its impact in a widespread way, extending past the immediate victim and touching the lives of friends, family, first responders, and even entire communities. Today's episode of Crime Squad Podcast features how a local author was impacted by the death of her schoolgirl crush. I had the pleasure of sitting down with Barb Dorrington and her partner in crime, Seana, to learn about what influenced Barb to begin writing her story, and how it led her in a very different direction, but certainly a direction that is unique and intriguing. This episode is about the journey that Barb took while writing her book, Trauma Monster.
I'm Seana Camp. I'm born and raised in London, Ontario. I always have been into true crime. I was first originally into the Jacqueline Dunleavy case. I read The Forest City Killer by Vanessa Brown, and I was immediately interested because it talked about Jacqueline Dunleavy and gave me more answers than anything I found. So that was super interesting, and I reached out to her, and I just asked her, like, what more can be done? Like, what can I do? How can I help? And she put me in touch with Barb.
So I'm Barb Dorrington, and I came to London when I was 18, went to school here, did both my undergrad and my master's here. I started at a children's agency as a social worker for a number of years, and then eventually moved to the school board as a social worker and also on the trauma team. Throughout the course of my years of work, I became a registered art therapist because I realized that talk therapy wasn't enough, and it didn't help heal people in the way that I was hoping. I was maybe more hopeful about how people would survive trauma. And then I also became a trauma and loss consultant specialist with the trauma and loss group in Michigan and worked for them for a while. So my background is really counseling to start, art therapy, and trauma. And so I did grow up in a violent home And I had a few traumatic incidents throughout my life too. And I had always been told you shouldn't talk about those things. I wanted a lot of the women in my book to know it's not oversharing, it's being brave. And being able to name your trauma, means that you can begin to tame it.
I need to paint a picture of these two wonderful women I've had the pleasure of working with during the book writing journey. Barb is small, but she's an absolute bulldog. If she thinks you have the answers to questions she has, she will hunt you down and find a way to talk to you. And I say this out of complete love for this tiny little brunette in her 70s, who would not only give you the shirt off her back if you needed it, but would also tell you to get it to fucking gather if you were in need of being set straight. She found me through my podcast and asked me to meet with her one day. And that is where I had the pleasure of meeting Barb, who not only exudes strength and kindness, but can also make a mean cup of coffee and always has baked goods to put out on the table. And Barb, she introduced me to Seana, who has since become a kindred spirit of mine, mostly because we're both passionate about true crime and could spend, quite literally, hours upon hours discussing aspects of crime. And we have, especially the London cases. Seana is the calm and quiet to Barb's go-get-'em persona, but they both play off each other and complement each other perfectly. I don't know if there's a correlation between short girls and true crime, but Seana and I are both the same height, coming in at 5'2", and I say that because it makes me so excited that I can look her in the eye instead of looking up at her. Short people, you'll understand this. These are the women in this podcast episode and the women I've grown to love so much for doing what they do. They're resilient, they're hungry to solve cases, and they're always making sure these victims are never forgotten. It started with a crush. It was the early 1960s in Windsor, Ontario, when a young girl laid eyes on an older boy. He was handsome in a boyish sort of way, and in addition to his close-cropped brown hair and large, soulful eyes, he also sported a friendly smile. And he was even cuter when he smirked. The little girl was named Barb, and she first came across her crush in the hallways of the elementary school they both attended.
I actually remember seeing Scott for the first time around grade 4. We were in the same grade 6 class, and so we saw a lot of each other. By the time he was in grade 7, really began to notice him and his long eyelashes and his friendly smile.
Barb was a self-professed geeky and somewhat weird, awkward little girl. She definitely marched to the beat of her own drum. And in the 1960s, for a little girl, when the general belief was that kids should be seen and not heard and little girls should play nice, it would be much later in life that Barb would embrace being unapologetic about being her uniquely wonderful self. At the time, something about Scott drew Barb in, and she was lucky because her older sister Kathy was friends with Scott's older twin sisters.
And I was kind of awkward and geeky, and while I had a few friends, I wasn't the most popular girl in school. And sometimes I'd ride my bike by his house just to see him on the way to a park called Stodgel Park. And one time he found me in Stodgel Park. He was riding his bike, and this sounds really weird, but I was playing with snakes. I loved snakes, and there were a lot of them in the area at the time. We're probably talking early 60s. And he caught me cuddling a snake, and I was horrified. I was embarrassed. And I thought, oh no, this is going to be all over the school, right? And I got back to school, and this was the year he was in my class. And I sat at the front, and he sat at the back, and I turned around and I looked at him, and he kind of smirked, but he never said a word to anyone about this incident.
I wish the happy ending to this story was that Barb and Scott became friends, and in a true coming-of-age story realized they were madly in love. I wish this story was about their loving marriage, their brood of children, and the life they built together. But in actuality, this story is much different. You see, this story is a tale of loss, of trauma, of grief. This story is one of murder. It was spring break of 1968, and Scott Leishman, who was 16 years old, was at his family home just outside of Thorndale, Ontario. The house sat and still sits on a corner lot surrounded by forested land. There is easy access to the Thames River, which provides not only a popular fishing spot, but also a place to look out and take in the beauty of nature. Accounts vary. Some say Scott was out fishing that day, but Barb's sister Kathy, who happened to be visiting the Leishmans on this very same day, says it was too cold for fishing. Other accounts say Scott, who was known to be quite the go-getter, was on his way to, or possibly from, a job he'd picked up at the hardware store in Thorndale. But one thing is certain, Scott was out and about on March 21st, and at some point he was picked up by someone in a white sedan. This wasn't unheard of, to see teens getting into someone's car at the side of the road. Hitchhiking was sometimes the easiest way to get around. Living outside of major cities proves difficult if you're a kid without a car to drive or a bicycle to ride. And because hitchhiking was a pretty basic way to get around for most people in rural areas, trepidation wasn't part of the equation. Scott didn't come home that day. The family knew it wasn't like Scott to take off and not come home. Right away, they knew something was wrong.
They had done all the usual, called all the friends, called all the schoolmates, and but they had hope, I guess would be a good way of putting it. It wasn't like him to disappear. It was Thursday of the March break. He had school the following Monday.
The Leishmans began doing what every family faced with this situation does. They started calling friends to see if they'd seen Scott. They called the police, who fluffed it off and said Scott was likely to return home soon. He was a 16-year-old boy after all, and boys will be boys. This cavalier attitude wasn't justified though, even though you might be thinking, well, why not? London was just a sleepy small town in 1968. Well, it wasn't actually. London was a hub of loss and unsolved murders at the time, and if you've read Murder City by Michael Arnfield or The Forest City Killer by Vanessa Brown, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, I highly recommend you pick up a couple copies and dive in. The truth is, between 1959 and 1984, London was home to the largest known concentration of serial killers in the world. In fact, 9-year-old Frankie Jensen had just gone missing February 9th, 1968 in London, Ontario. And according to Detective Dennis Alsop's notes, Frankie was last seen getting into a white sedan. The fact that police felt there was nothing to be concerned about was alarming. And the search for Scott wore on as the days continued to pass by. Scott didn't come home. Scott didn't call or send a letter to his family to let them know he was okay. You see, Scott had tragically been murdered. In a strange twist of fate, Barb's sister Kathy, the one who had been visiting the Leishmans on the same day Scott went missing, happened to also be visiting their home again on May 15th, 1968. The family had changed so much in such a short amount of time. It was quiet, and the air was filled with a foreboding sense of dread. There was hope, but there was also the sickly, feverish feeling of fear. It hung heavy in the air around the house and its inhabitants. In the end, on May 15th, an unsuspecting fisherman found Scott floating in the water in Port Burwell. He'd been missing nearly 2 months by this point. Port Burwell is around 75 kilometers away from Thorndale, which is where Scott had last been seen on March 21st. Scott was deceased, and the autopsy revealed his life had been taken shortly after he had gone missing. The cause of death was drowning, and it was believed he was thrown into the water while unconscious off a bridge in nearby Vienna. In ways all too similar to the way Scott's life ended, tragically, Frankie Jensen suffered the same horrific fate. I plan to cover Frankie's case in a different episode, so I won't get into details here. But what I will say is this. Frankie's body was found 2 months after he'd been abducted, and he was located less than a kilometer away from Scott Leishman's residence. The proximity is worrisome, and Detective Michael Arntfield posits in his book, Murder City, that Frankie and Scott met their horrific ends at the hands of the same man.
In fact, one theory, and it was only a theory, was that the neighbor may have spotted Scott down by the riverbanks, which he did a lot, and maybe he actually discovered the body or saw it or something, because there was a campground just down the road and there was flat land to the water in a perfect fishing spot. And that's almost exactly where Frankie's body was discovered.
This, of course, remains to be proven. But with historic cases like these, sometimes theories are all we have to hold on to. Although this was the end of the search for Scott, for his family it was just the beginning of a long road of despair. Sadly, his father ended his own life in 1978. He was never quite the same after the loss of his only son. And for Barb, the impact hit hard. Although she was merely on the periphery of this tragedy, trauma, like I discussed earlier in this episode, has a ripple effect. Barb always wondered about her crush Scott. What happened to him? Why did his life have to end? And why was the case still unsolved? It's because of Scott that Barb started her journey into London's historical cases. The quest for information on Scott Leishman's life and death led Barb down a path of realization. Disenfranchised grief is a very real thing.
And what I mean by those terms is that these are stories that you don't feel right about telling people because a mother lost her daughter, right? A grandparent lost her grandchild. A teacher no longer has that child in the class. And what you experienced is horrifying, okay? But society doesn't completely understand and value what that did to you as a young child, putting goosebumps on your arms as you think about it now. Mm-hmm. You feel a level of shame. I'm generally speaking, I mean, mm-hmm. not you, yeah. But you feel a level of shame. And even now you're probably thinking, do I have even a right to feel this way? But you do. Mm-hmm. You do have a right. Other examples of disenfranchised grief include losing a pet, having a miscarriage, losing an internet friend online. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like you never met the person, but they disappear or they die or whatever. Mm-hmm. These are losses that society doesn't value in the way of a death of a parent or a child.
Tragic events aren't limited in how far-reaching they are. But also, for those that are impacted by trauma that doesn't directly involve them, well, they all feel like they don't have a right to feel the way they do. To remember the traumatic event like it was yesterday. To shed tears for a person they'd only met in passing, if even at all. Barb began to formulate this realization into a plan. And this is where the concept for her book, Trauma Monster, came from.
The book is literally about all of the stories by the storytellers after I started investigating Scott's murder, trying to find people who will talk to me. I realized I wasn't going to get any more out of the newspaper reports. I realized after a long time that the police were never going to talk to me. Seana and I already had Dennis Alsop's notes. And so the missing piece of information that had never come forward were the stories of the people. We started meeting people, meeting a lot of the storytellers and taking down information. And I believe that the storytellers felt really calm and genuinely heard, because here I was, an older woman doing my thing, and Seana was the younger woman doing her thing, and it just blended. It's really important that these stories be heard, and I believe that the people who told us their stories really actually did feel heard for the very first time. Came forward, ended up doing in total over 60 interviews. We didn't use all the stories in the book, but they were very powerful stories. And the one big criticism that Seana and I received is, how do you know if they're telling the truth? How do you know if their memory is correct? Well, in memory, people see it the way they see it, right? And I realized that. But what happens in traumatic memory is that if you're grabbed right now, if somebody came and grabbed you, you would have a certain sensation, you would see a certain visual, you would hear a certain sound, and that would stick with you like glue. But you might not notice, if it was me doing it, what I'm wearing. Okay? You might not notice if somebody threw you into a car, whether it was a 2-door car or a 4-door car. So we were bearing in mind that the stories were as accurate as they could be. The book will be coming out sometime in May, probably around the middle to the 3rd week of May. It will be available on Amazon. There's a lot of trauma material in there about how trauma works. Okay. And there's also a trauma workbook at the end about how you can manage your own trauma.
Scott Leishman was abducted and murdered in 1968 at just the age of 16. As we've heard here, not only did it impact his immediate friends and family in ways they could never really recover from, it also affected the little girl turned woman that had a crush on him so many years ago. Scott's case is still unsolved, though there are theories, but none have been solid enough with evidence to stand up in court. It's difficult to imagine that it's been 57 years since Scott's life was taken, and yet there are still no answers. Barb and Seana started this journey to find out more about Scott and to hopefully bring an end to the mystery shrouding the case. They didn't succeed in naming his killer, but it was certainly a noble attempt. The last thing they expected, though, was to find others in London and its surrounding communities that have stories of their own about the historic and unsolved cases from this time period. I will definitely be doing a London, Ontario series in the upcoming months where we'll talk about the cases such as Jacqueline Dunleavy, Jackie English, Frankie Jensen, Helga Beer, and so many others. To some, it just doesn't make sense. Barb and Seana experienced a lot of hate at the onset of their gathering stage. As they began soliciting stories from people who wanted to come forward and talk about their grief and pain, people on the sidelines wondered why they were bothering. Why continue to press forward with things from the past? Some of these storytellers, though, were just children when they experienced these traumatic events. Barb hopes that by putting out her book, Trauma Monster, people can feel validated about their own disenfranchised grief. She hopes to show that London is a resilient community because, as a community, we've been wounded. And in healing, we've all learned to stay quiet about the traumatic events we've experienced.
My feeling was, and I'll be straightforward about this, is that we were badly hurt, badly injured by all these unsolved murders. There's still about 15 unsolved murders from that time. When a child has a traumatic event or a teenager and they come home, and a lot of them don't even tell their parents. They keep it secret, and they learn that it's important to keep bad things private and secret, and it becomes part of their personality. Now, when that person grows up and has a family, that's their belief system. You don't talk about these things. You don't reveal the bad underbelly of life. And then it becomes a family trait because now your siblings are doing it, your kids are doing it. We're all being very, very quiet. if you get too many unsolved murders in one community, in one spot, you have all these families who have learned that being quiet about these things is the most important value, and it becomes community culture. And I believe that that's why you have that real division of people saying, why don't you just let it alone? It was 50 years ago. What is wrong with you? And I'm saying, let them do what they need to do, and we will be respectful. Let us, the storytellers, the people who've gone through trauma and kept our stories private, tell our stories. Let us do what we need to do, and we can actually coexist together in the same space. But being angry at us for revealing the underbelly isn't helpful. And as a matter of fact, most of the storytellers have said that they really feel better having told their story now. It isn't closure. I think closure is a myth. I think you get it out and you come to a new stage, a new level of understanding, but you still bear the pain of the trauma. So it's really important that these stories be heard.
Well, Squad, that's going to do it for this month's episode of Crime Squad podcast. I'm so happy that you joined to listen to the interview of Barb and Seana. Be sure to look out for Barb's book, Trauma Monster. You can purchase it on Amazon. And Barb is actually doing a book launch, which sold out so quickly, but I'll be happy to be in attendance. And I think she might actually look to do another one, so stay tuned. I will post the information on social media, so if you're interested in attending, you can. Stay tuned for more true crime in the next month, and thanks again for joining. Remember to always stay safe and be kind to each other.